Hi, I have hay fever really bad. If you didn't know, I have a podcast called This Case Takes Place. It's over on a separate channel called This Case Takes Place. We're going to be uploading once a week, and don't worry, everything about this channel is staying exactly the same. But if you want to see more content, check out, pinned in the comments and in the description, there'll be a link to the channel. Please go check it out. I'd be very grateful. Thank you. Bye. This case takes place in the UK in the year 2014. Those familiar with the channel may recognise this case for its disturbing crimes and the profound failures of the British justice system. But today, the investigation goes deeper than before. Who exactly was the perpetrator, and why was the public not made aware of his historical crimes? This is a case that divided opinion. Meet Sarah Sands. Sarah Sands was a 32-year-old single mother who had been raising 5 children alone. By mid-2014, Sarah moved with her family into a council house in Silvertown, East London. She was hoping to make a fresh start. Little was publicly known about the family's past or their previous home, but reports suggest that the move to Silvertown happened only a few months before their lives changed forever. Sarah managed without the support from her children's fathers, instead relying on the state and her mother to help. Her entire life revolved around her children, particularly her 3 youngest sons, Bradley, Alfie, and Reese. These lived with her at the time. She had 2 older children as well, but they weren't central figures in the events that unfolded in 2014, and they lived elsewhere. Bradley was 12 and was the eldest. He was outgoing, responsible, and eager to take on new opportunities. He also took pride in looking after his younger brothers, the twins Alfie and Reese. They were 11, and they shared a very close bond. Alfie was thoughtful and quieter than Bradley, but like his brothers, he loved football and spending time outdoors with his friends. Neighbours described all 3 boys as energetic and always willing to help around the estate, enjoying typical childhood activities together. Despite limited resources, Sarah worked tirelessly to instill good values into her children. She cooked their meals, walked them to school, and shielded them from the hardships of life the best she could. Neighbours described Sarah as warm, friendly, and sociable. She was quick to form connections and always willing to help others, especially those in need. On the Silvertown estate, Sarah regularly checked in on the elderly residents who lived there. She was caring and trusting. But in 2014, no one could have imagined how quickly their lives were about to unravel. Silvertown initially appeared to offer a fresh start for the Sands family. The estate they moved into was a typical working-class neighbourhood, with rows of flats overlooking a playground and a primary school. Sarah and her boys quickly settled in and began building relationships with their neighbours. One neighbour in particular soon became a familiar presence in their lives: Michael Pleasted, a 77-year-old retiree who lived alone in the same housing block. Michael was well known across the estate and was regarded by locals as a friendly, helpful old man who worked part-time at the corner newsagent shop. His grandfatherly manner easily earned the trust of residents, including Sarah. She befriended him shortly after moving in and saw him as a lonely, elderly neighbour who needed some company. Sarah would frequently visit his flat for cups of tea and friendly conversations. She even occasionally brought him home-cooked meals and later said, "I thought he was a lovely old man." Sarah was thankful for Michael's neighbourly support. As a busy single mum, having someone older nearby who appeared to care about her family felt reassuring. Michael basically became an honorary uncle, with the children calling him Uncle Mick. Neither Sarah nor her neighbours suspected anything sinister about him. Even local authorities had no idea. None of them knew that he was concealing a disturbing criminal past. Over the autumn of 2014, Michael offered Sarah's eldest son Bradley a small weekend job sorting newspapers at the corner shop. It seemed like an exciting opportunity for a young boy eager to earn some pocket money. Sarah trusted Michael and agreed to let Bradley take the job. On a couple of occasions, Bradley even brought with him his younger twin brothers, Alfie and Reese, and they too would help out. However, not long after beginning the job, Bradley abruptly insisted that he no longer wanted to work for Michael. He then grew unusually withdrawn at home. Sarah was busy managing the daily chaos of raising 3 young boys, but noticed that Bradley had become moody and she struggled to get him to open up about what was troubling him. The twins also appeared to be anxious at times and eventually began to avoid Michael's flat altogether. Sarah wasn't sure why, and her mind did not yet leap to the unthinkable. She trusted Michael completely and never suspected what he was capable of when no one was watching. However, in late October of 2014, Sarah discovered the devastating truth about her neighbour. Accounts differ slightly on how the revelation came about, but all agree that it shattered the family. Sarah's twin sons confided in her one evening that Michael had subjected them to SA whilst in his flat. Bradley, who had been visibly distressed for weeks, finally broke down and revealed to his mother that Michael had abused him too. Bradley began rocking and crying, and then began pulling his own hair out. Sarah's immediate reaction was devastation and overwhelming guilt. Reflecting later, she said, "There are no words to describe how it eats you up from the inside. It's horrendous. The guilt, the pain, the sheer shame. It's my job to protect them. I should have known. It eats me alive." Sarah had trusted Michael completely. She allowed him into her home and believed he was a friend. She now realized that he had betrayed her trust in the most despicable of ways. Sarah did exactly the right thing and immediately contacted the police to report Michael's crimes. Officers quickly responded and arrested Michael at his flat on charges related to SA. The case was handled by Snaresbrook Crown Court in East London. He made his first court appearance in mid-November of 2014. During his hearing, the charges against him were formally read, and a trial date was set for February 2015. Michael pleaded not guilty, strongly denying the allegations and signalling that he intended to fight these charges at the trial. Michael never admitted to any wrongdoing. When confronted, he insisted repeatedly that the children had fabricated their stories and that he was totally innocent. However, the prosecution began looking deeper into just who Michael actually was, and they uncovered some very important information. It turned out that Michael had 24 prior convictions dating back to 1970. In the 1970s, he had a 2-year and 9-month prison sentence for indecent assault similar to what he had just been charged with. Then in the 1980s, he was accused and found guilty of the same thing and was sentenced to a further 4 years. Again, later that decade, he served 6 years in prison for a set of serial offences, whereby he again committed indecent assault and full-blown SA on minors. One takeaway also from this deep dive into Michael's horrific past was that he was in fact called Robin Malt. It was after a spree of essays in 1991 that he took advantage of a loophole which allowed him to change his identity. It's at this point that he became Michael. This was a loophole allowing him to move into new communities and workplaces without his record following him behind. Now, because of all of these prior convictions and these new victims, along with him living near a park and a primary school, the prosecution firmly argued that Michael should remain in custody until trial. This would surely be the most sensible thing to do. However, Michael's defense pushed back against this. Michael's barrister emphasized Michael's advanced age, deteriorating health, and his long-standing ties to the community. The defense lawyer also said that he had not been convicted of any new offences for nearly 2 decades before these accusations were discussed. The defense also repeatedly stressed Michael's presumption of innocence and his categorical denial of the allegations. They really pushed that these charges were completely false. And magically, these arguments ultimately persuaded the judge to grant Michael bail. The defense assured the court that Michael would adhere to the bail conditions and to attend his upcoming trial. The court did impose some conditions, such as that Michael was explicitly forbidden from having any contact with anyone under the age of 18. However, the court did not require Michael to relocate. He was allowed to return home to his flat on the estate in East London, the very place where his victims lived. This meant that a 77-year-old accused attacker, previously convicted of similar offences and now facing 3 more allegations, was allowed to live just meters away from the children he had allegedly victimised whilst awaiting his trial. Sarah and her boys believed that justice would be served after he was arrested, expecting that the courts would remove this predator from their lives. But sadly their relief was short-lived. After the arrest, they found out the result of the pre-trial hearing. Sarah felt utterly betrayed and terrified for her and her boys. She later expressed her outrage openly, asking the police, "Why would you house a man who has done this to multiple children?" She was furious that the authorities had allowed the safety of her family and other local children to be jeopardized. For Bradley, the fear was almost unbearable. He later described vividly how Michael's flat was so close to theirs that if he opened a window, he could see directly across the road and see his apartment. From that moment on, the family's life spiraled into crisis. Desperate to protect her family at any cost, Sarah turned to the police again for help. But here's the best part. The authorities advised her to move her family elsewhere for their safety. With no other choice, Sarah followed their recommendations. She quickly packed some bags and moved her sons in with her mother's small flat, which was some distance away. The sudden uprooting deeply traumatized the entire family. Practically overnight, they had lost their home and the fragile stability Sarah had worked so hard to build. Conditions at their grandmother's flat were extremely cramped. Bradley later recalled that the family had virtually no privacy, with everyone crowded into one single bedroom. The boys slept together in the lounge, plagued by fear and nightmares. Sarah's mother did everything possible to comfort her grandsons, tucking them in each night and reassuring them that they were safe, but it remained an uphill battle. Meanwhile, Sarah herself was crumbling emotionally. She felt immense guilt for failing to recognize the danger earlier, and was consumed with rage that Michael had remained free and living so close by. Why did she have to move? Why was he allowed to walk free? Each passing day felt like torture. Sarah later revealed that the family received no support from the authorities after the initial police involvement. She said that the system left them all feeling utterly abandoned. Victim support services offered little meaningful assistance, even though the boys were expected to give testimony at trial after Michael pleaded not guilty. Sarah remembers vividly her desperation and frustration at the time, noting that her children faced enormous additional trauma by potentially having to confront their abuser in court. The stress was overwhelming. Sarah's boys suffered breakdowns and panic attacks, and the looming trial intensified their trauma and distress. However, Michael would never make it to court. On the 28th of November 2014, Sarah was staying at her mother's flat. The flat was several miles away from their previous home on the Silvertown estate. Early that evening, Sarah had reportedly been drinking heavily alone in her mother's flat. She later told police and journalists that she had consumed either 2 bottles of wine or brandy to cope with the immense emotions that she was experiencing. She described herself as being in a state of emotional crisis, overwhelmed by grief, guilt and fear. She paced the flat, staring at photographs of her sons, and became increasingly distressed as the night wore on. It was at the peak of these heightened emotions that Sarah decided that enough was enough. She was going to end all of this strife by getting a confession out of Michael. However, either for her own defense or to ensure she received the confession she deserved, she decided to take a 12-inch kitchen knife on the journey. After 7 p.m, she left her mother's flat in East London. CCTV captured her with her hood up, walking towards Michael's flat in the neighbouring block. She reached Michael's door and knocked, waiting to look the man in the eyes who had tormented her sons. When Michael answered the door, she confronted him. She asked him to admit the truth. At first, he denied everything and claimed that the children were lying. When Sarah didn't accept his denial, his demeanour reportedly changed. According to Sarah, the mask dropped. He smirked and became arrogant, repeating that her sons were lying and had ruined his life. Sarah later described that moment felt like the whole world had frozen. She said she felt a surge of fear, anger, and disgust. Michael started moving towards her, allegedly to grab or push her. So in response, Sarah had her right hand on Michael and the knife in her left. When Michael lunged, she began to strike. She stabbed him repeatedly, in a state of panic and rage. He was stabbed 8 times, mostly in the chest and hands, as he tried to defend himself. The attack was sudden, frenzied, and overwhelming. Michael managed to crawl from the living room into the hallway of his flat, where he eventually collapsed. He died at the scene from his injuries not too long after. Meanwhile, Sarah fled, still carrying the knife. CCTV later showed her walking away from the estate. She then made her way back to her mother's flat. When she returned to her mother's flat, she was visibly shaken. About an hour later, she decided to hand herself in to the police. She went to a nearby police station, still covered in Michael's blood, and with the knife in her possession. Officers reported that she was upset and shaking as she admitted that she had killed Michael. "I took care of him. I stabbed him," she told them. The police went and examined the scene. There they found Michael dead in a pool of his own blood. News then reached back to the station where Sarah was being held. She asked the officers if he was dead. When told the news that he was, she replied, "He's effing harmless now, ain't he?" implying that he can no longer hurt any children. Following her voluntary surrender at the police station, Sarah Sands was arrested and charged with the murder of Michael. Investigators secured several key pieces of evidence linking her directly to the crime. These included her immediate confession, the full sequence of CCTV footage capturing her movements to and from the scene, and of course, the 12-inch kitchen knife was found in her possession. The forensic evidence was collected from both her bloodstained clothing and the interior of Michael's flat. Whilst held in custody, she consistently acknowledged having stabbed Michael, but stated that she had not set out with the intention to kill. The Crown proceeded to trial at the Old Bailey, London Central Criminal Court in July of 2015. During the trial, the court heard detailed testimony about the events leading up and during the confrontation at Michael's flat. Sarah Sands gave evidence in her own defense and described her mental state at the time of the incident. According to her testimony, the decision to approach Michael that evening was driven by desperation and emotional turmoil following the discovery of what he had done to her children. She stated clearly that she had intended to speak with Michael and persuade him to confess, to spare her children the trauma of testifying in court. The court now heard that once confronted, Michael denied the allegations, reportedly mocked them, and refused to show any remorse. Sarah told the court that his response caused her to lose control. The prosecution accepted the facts of the stabbing, but argued that the killing was deliberate and an act of retribution. After hearing all of the evidence, the jury rejected the charge of murder and instead returned the verdict of manslaughter. The jury found Sarah guilty of manslaughter, concluding that she unlawfully killed Michael in a sudden loss of control provoked by his behaviour. In September of 2015, Sarah Sands was sentenced at the Old Bailey for the offence of manslaughter. The presiding judge described the case as exceptional. He acknowledged the gravity of the offence and made it clear that the taking of life must publicly be condemned by the courts. However, he also recognised the unique set of circumstances in which the killing occurred. The court did accept that the killing was not a cold-blooded vigilante killing, but was instead a response to a powerful emotional provocation. However, in delivering the sentence, the judge warned against the normalization of revenge killings and stated clearly that individuals must not take justice into their own hands. Several mitigating factors were identified in favour of Sarah. These included her decision to surrender voluntarily at the police station, her immediate and full confession, her cooperation with the investigation, and her genuine expression of remorse once she was in custody. Based on these factors, and taking into account the impact of the events on her mental state, the court imposed a sentence of 3 years and 6 months in prison. Now, this sentence was notably lower than the standard range for fatal knife offences, which can often result in custodial terms of up to or exceeding 10 years. The judge explained that the original sentence had been considered at 7 years, but he applied a significant reduction. The judge also made remarks regarding the failings of Michael's pre-trial and scrutinised the bail decision. But the case didn't end there. The original sentence was reviewed by the UK Attorney General, who referred the case to the Court of Appeal on the grounds that it might have been unduly lenient. In January of 2016, a panel of senior judges at the Crown Court of Appeal ruled that the sentence should be increased. The panel considered several aggravating factors in reaching their decision. These included the fact that Sarah Sands armed herself with a kitchen knife before leaving home, which suggested a level of premeditation. The panel also considered her failure to seek medical assistance after the attack, and the fact that she left Michael to die. These elements, in the view of the appeal judges, placed the offence in a more serious category of manslaughter. As a result, the Court of Appeal increased the sentence from 3 years and 6 months to 7 years and 6 months imprisonment. Sarah Sands appeared via video link during the appeal hearing. She did not contest the outcome and accepted the revised sentence. It's suspected that she felt relief that her nightmare was over, and 7 years is a fair price to pay for her children's safety. However, the decision to increase her sentence left a large portion of the UK population furious with the judicial system. Sarah was released on parole in August of 2018 after serving approximately 4 years in custody. She spent her sentence at HMP Holloway and later HMP Bronzefield. During that time, she struggled with guilt and at times experienced horrendous thoughts. But she phoned her sons daily and focused on staying strong for their sake. Following her release, she was reunited with her children, who by then were in their mid to late teens. The case had attracted widespread media coverage and sparked a national debate on parental revenge, criminal justice, and the consequences of systematic failure. Public opinion was somewhat divided. A lot of people, particularly parents, viewed Sarah as a mother who acted out of desperation and praised her actions as protective and necessary. But there were some people who believed that taking the law into one's own hands could not be justified under any circumstances, regardless of motive. The case raised difficult questions about justice, morality, and state responsibility. After Sarah's release, her 3 sons chose to speak publicly about their experiences. Their account was later featured in a BBC documentary. Each of the boys spoke openly about the lasting impacts of what they endured, and of course, the events that followed. They made very clear that they did not blame their mother for what she had done. Bradley described the fear of living directly across from the man who had harmed him. He said that being forced to see Michael's home every day had been a source of constant fear. Alfie reflected that if Michael had been properly imprisoned, none of this would have happened. The boys stated that their mother's actions made them feel safer. Reese said it was comforting to know Michael could never hurt anyone ever again. However, he also acknowledged the emotional turmoil, especially the separation from their mother during her time in prison. Despite the trauma, the brothers thanked their mother for protecting them. They credited her with preventing further harm. In later interviews, following her release, Sarah stated that she did not take pride in what she had done, but she felt a relief that Michael could no longer harm anyone else. She said she did not view herself as a murderer and expressed that although she knew her actions were illegal, she did not regret them. She accepted the consequences of her actions and said she had been raised to take responsibility. Sarah later began campaigning for changes to the law to prevent convicted offenders from changing their names to escape detection. Her case had exposed how Michael had changed his name to hide his long record of horrific crimes. Sarah called for legislation to stop known sex offenders from concealing their past through legal name changes. She argued that any person convicted of these kinds of crimes should lose the right to change their identity. Her campaign was even supported by several members of Parliament. In response, the Home Office launched a review into a loophole in 2021. The full findings were not published due to security concerns. Despite this, Sarah Sands continued to campaign for legal reform. She stated that someone like Michael should be treated as a national threat. and that the state must take stronger action to prevent repeat offending. The case of Sarah Sands remains a tragic and complex example of a family failed by the system. It began with a single mother moving her children into what she hoped would be a better life. Instead, she discovered that her trusted neighbour was a known and twisted abuser. Sarah took drastic action and she paid a heavy price. But the question is, what would you have done?